Hello, welcome to this tutorial series of the system design. Till today, we have looked into leader election, gossip protocol, and all these things. Today, we are going to look into machine coding problem or object-oriented design problem, which is widely been used to test candidates to come up with a workable solution in a span of 1.5 to 2 hours of time. So, the problem statement is this. Usually, the interviewer or the company would ask something like this. So come up with the design for a problem statement. So the problem statement that we are going to look into is come up with a design object oriented design for a bill sharing app or a expense sharing app. Um, so you might have seen so what there will be only this requirement. Usually you will not have much details to ask, but since this is a kind of tutorial and prepping up for the interview or come up with a design, so I have added some more few lines to make the listeners understand that how would they need to approach the problem. Okay, so think. They might also can give few lines of what is the expectation. So the app that we are designing allows the user to share an expense between list of users. That is the main requirement if you have seen it, and if you have not come across a basic design, you can go and ask what is that, but usually this will be one line or a two line of questions. uh, so the users will be able to organize the expenses in multiple heads and share it with multiple users. For example, if two or three people are going for a tour or a picnic, a designated person may choose to spend, and the person might want to share the expenses across different heads. For example, fuel to tickets, to food, to recreation or whatever it is. The user should be able to allocate the expense in different heads, and they should be able to share it with multiple different set of people. It may not be the same set of people. That is the primary requirement. The users should be able to register themselves. First of all, when somebody has to create an expense sharing and share it with others, they have to be registered. The users should be able to create a group. The users can the user who is creating this expense should be able to share the expense among the members in the group. So what it means is the primary user should be able to define a custom group and then bring in users with appropriate email ID and name, and then bifurcate the expense and share it with others. That's the primary intent behind it. Users should be able to send a notification to those people who the expenses to whom the expense is shared via an SMS or notification of it. That is not primarily covered at this point, but this is an extended solution, right? When we are talking about it, the solution should be extendable. So whenever somebody contributes to it or fulfills their share, they should be able to add the bank details and other details as part of the transaction when they are contributing. They should be able to track who has paid, who has not paid. They should be able to, the user who is creating an expense should be able to track the payment details. Um, User should be able to register, and when the user is registering, the user registration happens in an idempotent way. A user will not be registered twice, so it is the same set of user. Um, Users will be able to register an expense, and when the expense is registered, the expense goes into a state called created state, because by this time the person who is gathering the expense should be able to only allocate the expense, and the expense details are just created. It has not been bifurcated. Once the user goes and adds the group of members to whom the expense has to be bifurcated, the expense state moves from created to pending. And finally, when all the users contribute and the total expense and the contribution by the users becomes zero, it goes to settle state. So there is a state change happens on the expense, right? Expense gets created once the user adds the contributors or the people whom they have to he has to or he has to share it with. It goes into pending state because people have not started paying, and once everybody paid, they should have the expense should move to a settled state. We can also add additional requirement here like this. Probably as and when the user pays or settles their due part of it, the person who has created the expense should get notification. So that can also be an additional requirement which will come. Those are all extra, but for the current use case, think only expense creation, sharing, and allowing payment. The initial state of the expense would be created, and the initial state of the expense would be created. The registered user should be able to create an expense group. That is to be able to add users to expenses. What does this mean is, user creates an expense, and user chooses whom they want to add and share with the expense with. The bifurcation need not be equal. For example, if people are going for recreation and one person is swiping a credit card just because they may have a better discount in that with that card provider, or they may get more points for that kind of expense. One of the person can choose to spend. But what happens is some of some people might have utilized the money little lesser, and some people might be more. So the bifurcation logic may not be equal. So the bifurcation logic is custom. The user who creates the expense would be able to bifurcate it in a custom way. So you need not think about equal spending, percentage based spending, need not like that. When the bifurcation is complete, as I said, as I pointed out, the state of the expense will become pending. The next thing is there should be a provision to extend or to provide the user notification, as I clearly pointed out earlier, that as and when an expense is created and the user is added to the particular expense statement, the assigned user to whom with whom the expense has to be shared may also can get a notification saying that okay, an expense is created by this person and you owe that person this much money. Such kind of notification should be accommodated, or we should be able to do it without much modification in the existing logic, right? So the point of this interviews would be testing your object oriented design skills and coming up with a quick design and code it within that short span of time. What happens is post you have submitted the solution, they would be able the interviewer would be adding some additional requirements. This usually happens in ThoughtWorks or many other companies, right? They will provide a problem like this. You will have you will have a take-home assignment, and then you will code it and submit it. And once you have once your solution pass through the set of test cases and the preliminary investigation, you would be called for an in-person interview. During that time, the interviewer would add more requirements. So we should define interfaces and methods and models in such a way that yes, a simple change should not cause the entire change in the entire code base as well, right? The classes should be defined in such a way that they are yes, they are open for modification, and they are open for extension and closed for modification, right? Like open closed principles, all these principles should be followed. That's what would be the expectation of this, right? That is what the interviewer will also be testing post successful submission of this thing. And Flipkart and other companies or many other companies have a machine coding round. They will give this problem statement as you enter in, and you might have to code it in their place. Probably internet access is available. You should be able to code it. Any number of users should be able to create expenses at the same time. So since this is an application, right, it is not designated to one user, right? The design should be in such a way that any number of users should be able to add expenses and track it. One user should be able to create more than one expense. It's not that one user will can create only one expense at a time. As I said, when somebody is going for picnic, a person holding more than one card should be able to spend, but they should be able to create more than one expenses, and create different expense groups, and then share the expense among others. The expense creator should be able to track. So the trackability is more important. That as and when the person received or did a payment, they should be able to track it. Uh, the most critical part of this requirement, the twist in the story is right. We should be able to allow the users to settle expenses in parts. What does this mean? For example, we when we think about this requirement, we will also think that okay, user who is willing to settle the amount, right? They'll be settling the amount in one shot. May not be. So user can do multiple payments on their particular share of the amount from different transactions. So those all should be tracked against a particular user, and then and the notification has to be sent. So this is a twist in this in the requirement. Users can settle the expense in part. The solution, as I pointed out, the solution should be extendable. Usually for machine coding rounds or anything, we need not go and think about how do we persist it. This is not a clear, this is not a exact system design. Right? It is more of a object orientation, testing your object orientation principles, and how you can come up with the solution for a particular piece of problem, and how you can implement it. How well you are thinking on the object oriented design, and then putting that in code. How are we writing test cases? That is the main intention of the this. We need not go and ask that how many concurrent users will be using, how is my deployment strategy. All these things we need not ask for this round, so you should not be asking it. So once the problem statement is clear, and considering the time in mind, we should think about how do we come up with the solution for it. The best approach that I would take, or I have taken after seeing this problem, is I started thinking about the domain. What is the problem domain? So the problem domain is expense sharing. So what is expense sharing? So expense seems to be an occurrence. Expense seems to be an occurrence which has occurred in the past. So what are the properties of expense? An expense should have occurred on a particular date. Obviously correct. So an expense should have a value to it, and the expense should be occurring for a particular reason, and a short description. This is what suddenly came to my mind. Oh, okay, an expense is an occurrence. So let's model that occurrence first. So expense date, and probably who has paid or something of that sort we can track. But an expense is an expense, right? Because it is the user who is creating an expense. It is assumed that the user is the owner of that expense. So I thought about that expense in that way. Second thing which came into my mind is okay. So the expense sharing app. So who is going to share this app? We need to think about it, right? It is a user, right? Whoever is the user is going to do it. So we need to model something called user. Okay, what is a user? What are the properties that we need to think about when we talk about user? A user will have a user ID and an email ID. They should have a phone number because we think that we need to send notification. These are and a username. We can add like the other details which are non-core attributes, right? Think of these are the properties that we can have, and so user is there, expense is there, but with this, if you start doing a mind map between what is expense, what is user, what are the, as we thought about, right? What are the states? We told that there are expense states, right? Expense gets created and it moves to pending, and it becomes to settled. So if these are states, right, how can we represent states? States can be represented as enum. So I have created an enum. Probably you can have a constant, but I've created an enum. It looks fine to me, so I've just created. So the other thing that we talked about is user, and the expense is shared among users, right? So user share should be there. So an association between an user and a share, what is that the person has to pay, that can be there. So those are the models that I can immediately think of, and I took a pen and paper and wrote it down. after I wrote it down, I formulated that this is how our use case has to be said. What is the driver program? How would somebody create this role? How can we run through the program, entire program, and show the output? So that has to be there in the mind as and when we execute. So user creates an expense, add other uh, users, share it, move it to pending. So this can happen automatically, and notify. Once notified, other people contributes. There should be an automated program which, as and when somebody contribute, if the the bill is settled. If so, move the expense to settled. So these are the steps which I suddenly came to my mind, right? So as we think through a problem, we should be able to connect dots. So it is not just coming up with models. We need to arrive at a way how can we connect all the dots, so that we can stitch the dots together and come up with an executable, right? So that is the way that we need to think about it. So with that being said, and with a clear introduction, let us directly jump to the code part of it. Mm, as I said, users are the one who is going to use this application. So it's good to have a user class. User class has something called name, user ID, and email ID, and phone number. Okay. So is it there? I miss it. Okay. Sorry, it is not organized properly. So let's take the phone number here. So user class has four properties: name, user ID, phone number, and email ID. User ID will most likely an auto-generated ID, which is system-generated ID. We need not expose it to the outside world. Email ID is the one which user interacts with, and I've kept a not null attribute. Whenever somebody creates a user, they must have an email ID and an optional phone number. You can have that as mandatory as well, based on the need of the application, or as you are preparing this application for a phone. If you are creating a front end which is like a phone based app, you can somebody can mandate phone number as a mandatory parameter. So based on that's up to the that's more of a implementation scenario, but we can have phone number, optional phone number, like that. The next thing which I thought, as I said, is an expense, right? Somebody has to create an expense, which for, so who creates an expense? A user. So I just first created the user. The next I thought about is an expense, right? So users are created. The users are immutable objects, right? So I as when somebody is creating a user, they should supply all three properties. It is not like somebody creates a user and set the phone number later. So users are created like this only. And next is expense. Expense, usually an expense should have any model will have an ID which uniquely identifies what is the type of that, whether it is an expense or anything has an ID, right? So just an ID, which is an auto-generated ID, which is what I can think of. Uh, who is the user who creates the expense? That is what is being captured here. For example, a person who spends and wants to bifurcate this expense among others, right? So that person is associated with it. So it contains an user ID. So what is the title of the expense? For example, a short title. What is the description of this expense? So we went there, we spent like this. So we can have a description on top of it. When the expense has occurred, which is the date time, and what is the status of this expense? So what are the states as we talked about? Expense status has created, pending, and settled. When the expense is created, it is created, and once users are assigned, it is pending, and once everybody pays it, it becomes settled. What is the amount? So any expense has an amount. So that's what is the expense. So these are the primary properties of an expense. But what it has, or it is what it knows is, this expense knows what is somebody is gelling the expense to group of people, right? So this expense has this many people, right? So I've created a class called expense group. So what does this expense group? Expense group is a set of people who are who has taken part or who has utilized this expense for a particular purpose. That's what we can think of. So expense group, I will repeat, expense group is are those people who are involved as part of this expense. They will become an expense group. An expense is aware or contains an expense group. It will set up member, so we need not go and add the same member again and again. So we create an expense with an expense group ID, which is a random ID. What are the members and what are the contributions? So I don't maintain an expense ID here because an expense group cannot exist in isolation. So it is a part of it. It is it expense contains an expense group. So I don't have an ID, like it's not like a foreign key relationship, but in databases it would be a foreign key relationship, right? Uh, so expense contains one to one expense group. Um, but expense group contain more than one user, right? So what is an expense group? An expense group contain more than one users who took part as part of the expense, right? Who has utilized some service as part of this expense. So I have some contributions. An expense group, we should be able to use this to track their contributions. So what is contribution? A contribution comes from a user share. What is a user share contains? An user share contains the user ID and then what is his share which he has to, the person has to pay, right? So this is where the expense creator assigns a share to the particular expense and a list of contributions. As mentioned in the requirement that the user may settle this expense at one shot, or the user can choose to settle the expense in multiple transactions. For example, they might want to settle a part of the expense from one account and part of the expense from other account. So if the user chooses to do that way, it should not create a problem for the person who settles this amount and then make some manual changes and do it. So it becomes difficult for the other person, the expense creator, to track it, right? So we have allowed multiple contributions for a particular share for which the user owes to the expense creator. So the user share contain user ID, share, and the contributions. Let us do it to the contribution. So what is a contribution? Contribution is the amount which somebody contributes for a particular expense or a share. It contains a ID, which can be UID. What is the value? A contribution should have a value, right? So it might be $1, $2, 1 rupee, 10 rupee, 100 rupees, 1000 rupees. That is the value. What is the transaction ID? Somebody contributes to an expense, right? So they might have transferred it via bank, they might have transferred it via phone, or might be a card payment or whatever it is. That transaction reference ID. So we need to capture it, and it is an occurrence of an event, right? So we must capture the occurrence type, which is the contribution date. And there can be a small transaction description. So we can say that this expense is for this. For example, if the same user is transferring money to different expenses for the same expense creator, right? An expense creator, as we think of as a recreation trip, they might have created, the person might have created different expense heads. So if we are giving a short description that okay, this is for this, this is for this, so it is easy for somebody to go and track. So this is a small transaction description. So since this contribution is clear, let's come to the user share. User share contains the list of contributions, and the expense group contains user share. User share contains the contributions. So when these things are stitched together, we will be able to create an expense. I think it is clear. I have created some exceptions. Let's look into it a little later. I've created a repository because while we execute a certain code, right? how would we go and track it? So I'm not saving it against a database. It's a very simple repository which is an in-memory map. So what is a user repository? User repository contains list of users identified by the ID and the objects, right? So this is how, if you think of this as a table, identified by, it's a key value store which contains the string users and the list of identifier and the object. So identifier is the ID and the object contains other properties related to user. That's a repository. It's a new hash map so that it is easy for somebody to go and filter it by based on the key which somebody is applying. It's like an email ID as of now. The expense repository is also a similar map which has a key called key which is the expense ID and the entire expense is the value. So as we looked into it, an expense contains the expense goes like this. The expense is aware of the expense group and the expense group is aware of the user share and the user share contains contributions. So this is how I have organized it and made it to work. There may be many other designs that you can think of it. So there is nothing called perfection that we can achieve in that short span of 1.5 to 2 hours of time, but as we should come up with the design in such a way that as we add new requirements to the existing problem statement, it should not go and break the entire contract if we have defined some interfaces or if we have defined some service classes. It should not go and break, or it should not, if I want to introduce something, it should not go and modify more than 3-4 classes, go and modify the entire model for it. So that's not allowed. But let's see how we will be able to do by while we walk through the output as well, and then we will try to add a futuristic requirement to the existing code and see whether the solution is extendable or not. So with that being said, let's look into the user service. Where is the service class? User service. So user service is I've just organized like a layered architecture. Like if you want to put some controller on top of it, instead of this main bring user controller and expense controller, it becomes a completely RESTful application. Feel free to go and do it. It's a very small thing that we need to do. Just have a create user or a post user which takes in the email ID and phone number. You should have an interface, and user should have a post to an expense of expense ID. It is not a post; it will be a put, because we are an expense should have contribute to an expense with an expense ID, right? So we can model like that, right? So that's a put method. We can think of that. So user service is going to create a user. We are creating a user with the email ID and name. What I do is I initialize a user with the properties that is being supplied, and I'm returning a new user. It might throw an exception if I make this if this is not null, right? So whenever a null value is passed, it throws a null pointer exception. So that can be cached at the end. So I am adding, because this is a static class, I am putting it to the map. If it is absent, I am putting it, because the requirement of adding users is, it has to be idempotent. That is the most important thing. So we have to go and check if the user already exists. We don't recreate the user. That is an important thing when it comes to any distributed systems as well, because at any point of time we might have created the user while sending the response, or the client would have lost the connection when they call the method. So whenever they supply the same value again, if the user already exists, we should not go and create it. Any method in distributed system most likely should be idempotent. So next is contribute the expense. We will come to that later. First of all, let's go to the expense service. So what are we doing here? We are creating expense service. We should be able to create an expense. First of all, the very first step, as I wrote, is create a user, create an expense. These are the two preliminary steps. I am creating an expense with an expense as a builder class, because once the expense is created, nobody should go and alter it, right? They should not go and fiddle with the expense. It becomes the authenticity issue. We are setting the ID, which is a random ID. We are setting the title, what is the title of the expense, what is the description, we can give 2-3 lines. What is the occurrence date of the expense, what is the expense amount, who is creating it, who is the user who is creating it, what is the status, the status is created by default as I said. And we are creating a new expense group because at the time of creating expense we are just creating a new expense group, and then we will be adding users to the expense group, right? I am building this expense and then returning this expense. What is saving here, we are putting the entire expense with the identified key in a hash map. A hash map contains the expense key, the id as the key, and the value is the entire expense that we have built. So user is created, expense is created. Next what we need to do is the expense creator need to identify the users to add to the expense, right? That's the next step in the workflow. That is method we should be writing it now. I'm adding a user to an expense. What I do, I go to the repository and in the entire map I get whether the expense exists or not. If it is not there, I am saying that okay, sorry, the expense itself is not there, so you please go and create the expense, or we can throw an exception here. These are important. You should throw expense does not exist exception of whatever method. Okay, so these are unexpected. You throw an exception instead of putting a print line. That would be appreciated in the object oriented design. Rather than printing it, it means that you have handled all the negative cases as well. So we need to do like that. Throws expense does not exist exception. So I think that's what it is. Throw new, I have to put, sorry. So this is how we need to operate. So what we do is when we are, so the method is to add users to the expense, right? So who are all part of this expense, who are all availed the service which for this somebody has spent, right? So we say this is the expense, for this expense ID add these users, which is the email ID. So find, what I will do is I will go and get the expense map, and then expense map contains the expense group which we have just created, and there is a group member. Expense group contains list of members, right? So who belongs to this expense, this is a set of users belongs to that expense, right? So I am initializing the group and then adding the user email ID to the group. So it means that go to the expense group, find get the expense set and then add the member to the appropriate expense set. This is what we are doing it here. So every time, why is this a set? Since it is, as I said, right, we should not be adding the same user again and again. It would cause duplicate values, and then the bifurcation logic will become difficult. So we have used the set that contains only unique values. That's why I've used the set here. Once the expense users are added to it, the state becomes pending, right? So that we'll look into it later. The next thing is we have to bifurcate the expense, right? Assign expense share, that's what I'm doing, or we can have this method as like bifurcate or whatever it is, right? So I've just say assign expense share. What percentage of the expense which user the user owes. So that is what is happening here. For a particular expense, what are the so how much the user owes. That is the method which is that is what is the logic which is happening here. So assign expense share, which takes in the expense ID, and then the email ID for that particular person, and what is the share value. As I said, it need not be equally bifurcated. We can add, for example, if somebody has to introduce that equal share, right? Assign expense share, and then instead of this double share, we can introduce something called, for example, if we need to extend this to like share type is equal, or share type is custom, we can, if as part of this extension. Let's look into the assign expense share. What am I saying? I'm checking whether the expense doesn't exist. If the expense does exist, I'm adding the user to the list of groups. Assume that if the user comes and says that, or the interviewer comes and says that, what if I have to introduce a policy called equal split policy, expense share type is split. So what we need to do is, we can add an overload method like a public add, where it takes the split policy, right? Split policy. If the split policy is equal, go ahead and do it. If the split policy is custom, let the user assign expense share. This is what we can do. What we are doing, we are not touching the existing methods. We are extending them. We are adding more functionality without affecting the existing functionality of it. If we are able to tell this, we should be in the right place, is what I'm thinking. Next, what we need to do is, okay, so once this is done, we should be able to notify it, right? That we've told that there might be another requirement will come from the user, that where will you notify it. So we can, once the user is added, right, post that we can raise an event. So we create a interface called notification service, and the notification expense service will have the visibility to notification service. Let's try to I'll just try to show it. Right click, new class, which is of type interface, notification service, which would contain a method called public void notify. So there is no public in the interface, sorry. Void notify, public interface notify. What is the problem? Notify cannot override notify. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so there is some problem with this function name. Let's look into it little later. So notify is a built-in method which is of object, so we should not be using a method called notify. So I'm just using a method called notify user. Let's create a notification service implementation. New Java class notifications, notification service impl, which implements notification service. Notification service, control O, override notify user. So this is where we might send this out. So you might push a message by taking, this can take in the user share or whatever property it is, which is like a email ID, or probably notify user means user ID, user GSR or email ID. We can take the entire user, because there might be many other implementations, like we can use the phone to notify, we can use email to notify. I'm taking the user and then share expense. We can take these two parameters. Based on these two, we can notify. So you have an expense which is created by this user, and notifying by email, Slack channel, or whatever it is, right? So once this is there, we can go and in the expense service, once the expenses, add users to the expense is there, if notification service is not equal to null, we can create a private notification service equal to null. We'll assign it, but probably we can think like a new notification service implementation. So what we can do is, if notification service not equal to null, we can say notification service dot notify user of user, or probably we have the expense ID, right? Notification notification not notification, sorry, expense repository dot expense map dot get of expense ID, and then comma, user repository dot user hashmap dot get of user ID. That's what we have, right? Our email ID. So we can get and pass these two parameters like this. What is this error? Just a second. Okay, the first parameter is user, second parameter is expense. So we can change those two parameter positions like this, and then the function is done. So what we are doing, so adding some functionality to the existing method doesn't break the existing method. We might just need to, if the notification service is null, the notification will not be done for that particular thing. When the user it is not done, we can do it. So we are adding functionality without much modification, right? The entire functionality, we are not going and changing every part of the code. So in this way, we can add these kind of questions will come, right? As they can dynamically provide, how do you add notifications, how do you notify the user when it is settled. These kind of things may come as part of the requirement, so we should be able to do it. So okay, then we have to go to user service, right? The expense is right, so the user will go and say that, okay, I have been assigned an expense, I have to go and contribute for the share which I owe, right? So user service that they say that, okay, I will contribute to the expense. When he says that he received the user received a notification, right? So when they receive the notification, they have an expense ID for which they have to contribute, and they have their email ID which they have to contribute. And what is the contribution? They have to create a contribution to contribute, right? So what they will do, when they'll go and check whether the expense exists or not. Once the expense is there, they'll go and get the expense. We have to go and get the expense group, because the expense group contains all the users who are belonging to that expense, right? If the expense is created, it means that no users are added properly. So the expense is in invalid expense state, right? The state of the expense is not in the right state. So we are throwing an exception. And what we should not do is, when the expense is settled, for example, if the expense is already settled and this method is getting called for the second time, we should say that, okay, the expense is already settled, we cannot go and accept the contribution. So we are throwing an exception here. These are all the boundary cases where we should think of and handle. So what am I creating here? I am creating a user share. User share is in the expense group dot get contributions dot get. We use the email to get the appropriate user share, because for that particular user they have to contribute. And if I'm just saying that, I'm just adding some more validation. If the user is trying to contribute more than the share value, the share they owe, I'm throwing a contribution exceeded exception, saying that, okay, boss, you are trying to contribute more than what you are supposed to do. I'm just throwing an error. Otherwise, I am adding the contributions to the user share. So the user share is part of the expense group, and the expense group is part of expense. So this gets added to it. So now what and all we have done, we have created the expense, we have created add the users to the expense, we have notified the people, and the user has contributed to the expense. And once the user has contributed to the expense, then everybody starts doing the same the approach, the entire expense becomes settled. So that is the last step in the flow. Let's look into the main. I have written test cases. We can run all the test cases. Even then I've added certain code, I'll run all the Java JUnit test cases. You should be able to write all the test cases as well. Okay. Okay, so there was a error, small error. So it ran with this code coverage. I have how much? So model is covered, repository is covered, service is covered, exceptions are not covered. So that's why the coverage is low. But if you think that you should be able to write the unit test so that it is visible to the others as well. It not visible, so you should write unit test and drive through the unit test as well. So we have just thrown an exception that is not caught, so that is why it is thrown an error. So I've just altered that unit test case. So since this is done, let me run The test only, there's no need of coverage. So I have tested contribute to the users contribute to expense, create user with null, add users to the expense, create a user, and then assign expense share, and then set the expense to the final state. Those are the test cases that I have done. Let's go to the main. So this is the usually for this machine coding round, the test cases should be already available, not the unit test cases. What are the user IDs that you need to give? You just need to copy paste. It took more time for me to come up with these test values. Otherwise, I was able to do it a little faster. So now what I did, I've created an expense service and the user service. So these are the classes which does most of the heavy lifting, which does all the business things, right? Which does all the business logic. So I'm initializing the expense service, I'm initializing the user service, I'm just creating test users. I have 20 users. Why I have created 20 users? So the idea is to show more than one sample as part of the demo. I'm creating an expense which is called create lunch expense. In the lunch expense, I'm saying the expense is for team lunch, and then the description is saying that we have gone for the lunch in particular hotel, which is Biryani Zone. I'm not advertising for them, but suddenly it came to my mind. It was near to my previous office, so I just used it. And the amount is some X amount of rupees, which is 2000 rupees. And well, the next thing is so who has created it? Who is the owner of this expense? This is Vishnu at gmail.com. I just used some random email ID, and it returns an expense. So when you create an expense, it returns an expense. Once the expense is created, we need to do the next step is bifurcate the expense. So when you bifurcate, you need to add users to the expense, right? Since we have an expense ID, I will pick the user and then add them to the expense. Once this is done, next should be assign share, assign expense share. So what we are doing here is we should ensure that we assign. So for the current use case, I have assigned the person who has paid it also should have a share. So sometimes it might be somebody who might have given this expense, done this expense, but they might not owe any money. So in that case, you can ignore that. You have to touch base and tell to the interviewer that okay, I have assumed that the person who is creating this expense has also taken part or utilized some services in the expense. So that's what my assumption is. You have to tell up in front so that it clarifies the other. So I have added 5 people for this expense, and once it is done, I am saying setting the status to pending. So it is created, now it is pending. The next thing that we need to do is we need to get all the users as part of this, and I am saying that every user go and contribute to the expense. This would be driven when it is a RESTful service. Somebody will do at any point of time what they want. Now we are talking about a small mini program that we are talking about. We have to drive through or look into all the use cases that we want, right? So that is why I'm saying for all the users which we have created, I am saying contributed. So it is not all the users that we have created, all the users that's part of the group, because an expense contains an expense group and the expense group contains all the group members. So I'm iterating through all the members and making the payment contribute to the expense. And I'm assigning a random transaction ID, and then I'm paying the entire amount what they owe, and then finally printing saying that okay, if the expense, I'm checking whether the expense is settled. This is what we did not look into, right? At some point of time we need to go and check whether the expense is settled or not. So what is that I am doing? I am going and getting the expense and getting all the users in the expense group, checking their share and whether they have paid or not. In that I'm listing through all the contributions. For example, the same user might have contributed twice because he might have done 2 transactions for the same share, right? We were talking about it. So for every share, I am subtracting with the total amount, and if the total and this are same or less than or equal to 1, you can say put equal to 0 only. I'm just putting less than or equal to 1. A marginal difference of 1 I am giving. For example, if the expense is in 0.89, somebody might not be transferring that 0.89. So if the expense is less than or equal to 1, it means that the expense is settled, and then saying that by and then coming out. Let's run this code. Kernel is going to run, but let's run. Okay. So you see here that we have, I've just done a live coding saying that notification is done. So for all the users, whenever the expense is created, so they have been notified as well. It happens asynchronously. So we were able to add or hook up some functionality without altering too much of the code. I am just running for the first time. So it ran. Finally, when the expense is settled, we are saying buy and done. So post this also, if we want to notify the user that who has created the expense, we should be able to use that notification service to notify. Okay, so this is I think we have come to the end of this tutorial, and we also touched base on how do we do it. This kind of we have also looked into, sorry, we have also looked into how do we extend the solution with different use cases. So what are the other use cases that we can think of, or it may come as part of this build sharing app is you can take it as homework, and probably I can also add some code and submit it, put it as part of my GitHub repository. What if you allow somebody to pay for others? For example, if somebody says that, okay, I will settle you next month, you settle this person today, which is called delegating. How do you handle that use case? That's an interesting problem to solve. This may come in object-oriented design. How do you do it? So what we can do is we can have add user payment, right? When it comes to user service, it is very easy. Contribute to expense ID, and then come up with a method which is saying like this: string email ID, string to email ID. So what can happen is, if the two email ID is existing, we will go and find that, and then appropriately do the payment or put the person's share over there. So we will be able to handle or extend our solution as we need to. This is a very difficult use case, right? This is not simply thinking like delegating somebody to pay on behalf of us, and then allowing the expense creator to create an expense is a bit difficult use case. But we have handled it with just a piece of code, right? We can still refactor all these things and extract the common method and do it, right? That is a different use that we can talk about later. But if you see how are we able to do it, we will just do it in no time. So in this contribution, we can have a description saying that delegated by or paid by. So simply with this, we could be able to handle complex use cases like this. And as I already pointed out, if you need to put a REST application, create a controller on top of it, and utilize all the hook up all the REST services, and come up with appropriate REST codes like the response codes like created for expense creation, and give the expense ID so that it is useful for some for the expense creation, and contribution also, right? Whenever the contribution is done, you can give a contribution ID back to them, so that you can provide get statuses on top of it. The only thing which we did not implement, which we have to implement this as a REST service, is get expense status. Right, that we can expose that as an expense status, or get an expense, put an expense ID, get the status, put an expense, give me the people who have paid. You can add certain get methods like given an expense, give me all the users who have paid, give me the users who have not paid, give me the users who have partially paid. So those are the use cases that we can think of in terms of REST service. But usually this, when these kind of questions are asked, never go and jump and think in terms of how do you model this as a RESTful service, how it will be exposed as a JSON. That's not the intention of this machine coding round. The intention of the machine coding round is to ensure that whether you are coming up with the right design which becomes extendable and which becomes which becomes easy for extension and modification as well, right? Any new requirements which comes, we should be able to do it, not modification. Any new requirement comes, which whether we are able to do it or not. The code repository is available in this place, github.com/gopalbala/build sharing. Please go ahead and take a look. I'm going to commit it, whatever changes that I have made also as part of this demo or the video in the GitHub repository. Until next time when we meet, till we meet, it is Bala. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. You are going to see a lot of machine coding problems, system design problems, which will be really useful for your interview preparation, or even if when you want to solve problems and come up with object oriented design. Please take these problems and solve it. And if you think that you have a better design than this, you take a branch out of it and then fork it and then raise a pull request. I should be able to accept it and do it. These kind of questions are not asked starting from beginner level to intermediate to lead level, right? When it is coming to beginner level, you will be provided a lot of inputs that what you need to do stepwise. When it comes to lead level object oriented testing, they will give only one liner of it. Come up with this design where this is the requirement, two, 3 lines of requirement. For a junior level, they may come up with some skeleton. They will see that whether you are writing it in the right way, you are coming up with the right model or interaction. So those kind of things they might provide. With this, thanks for your time. Bye.